Hello, Denise. This is our second mentoring video, and we're going to go over a lesson that I observed for Caitlin a couple of days ago. So, Caitlin, do you want to start by summarizing the lesson that I observed?
Yes, so I taught a lesson last Friday on motifs in literature. Specifically, we also focused a lot on motifs in the novel that we're reading, Tangerine.
Right.
So we started talking about some other vocabulary that they are familiar with, like what is theme and what is symbolism. They're a lot more familiar with symbolism than motif. It's kind of a new concept this quarter. I showed them about 10 minutes of video examples. There were a lot of Disney examples in that, and that's something that they're all really familiar with.
Right.
So they were starting to recognize patterns. And then from there, we branched out with what are some things we could recognize in Flipped, which was a novel we read aloud last quarter. What are some motifs we might have noticed there? And then we talked specifically about motifs in Tangerine, and then we did a short activity afterwards, like an individual assignment.
Right, and that was after I left.
Yes.
Right, okay. One of the things that I wanted to point out that I thought you did really well, and this is one of the best practices that we're supposed to be doing at Turlock Junior High and in TUSD, is that you went over your objective. I think you went over it a couple of times before you even started the lesson. And then I can't remember, did you refer back to it?
I think maybe not in the exact language I did, but I did try to summarize after I read how the objective is written. I said, we're going to find the motif, we're going to explain why it's important, and then we're going to analyze it a little bit further. So as we went on, I said, okay, now we found some motifs.
Right. What are some other things that you think went well with that lesson?
I think giving wait time for some of those questions, that was important, because I've noticed my kids particularly, their instinct is when I ask a question is to say, I don't know. And so I'm like, it's okay. Let's stop and think about it. Discuss, partner, pair, share. I think that helped a lot, because usually if you didn't remember something, your partner did. And then you can share that information. And I think typing out their answers, we did have the lesson in Pear Deck. So I think having some time to type it out, that I think kind of eases some tension they have and gets everyone to participate.
Yeah, definitely. So what do you think didn't go so well? Something that maybe for next time you thought to yourself like, oh, that needs to be tweaked or changed a little bit.
I think what overall kind of threw me off in this lesson is that you didn't observe my first period. You observed my second class, and my first class was so much more vocal in their participation that kind of set a bar to where I was having trouble sometimes gauging if my kids in the class you observed were understanding.
Okay.
So even though I had checked for understanding in there, I think going forward I need to broaden or branch out with that a little bit more, maybe do random selection. And I try to avoid that to not give my kids anxiety about that, but maybe to check in more randomly, because if I just have the same 3 kids saying, yeah, I get it, that's not really a good judge.
What are some ways that you think that you can reduce that anxiety, but still kind of do random calling in the classroom?
Maybe I could say, okay, I'm going to randomly call on someone, so use this time to discuss with your partner. And then they have some prep time.
Yeah, be prepared and ready before. Yeah, definitely. What about checking for understanding? Because that sounds like something that, like you said, you were trying to gauge how much they knew, especially compared to your first class. So what kind of checking for understanding went on?
So after I would give them a definition, I would give them some time, and I would pose a question like, can you think of any symbols in Flipped that we read? And then give them some time to either discuss it or type their answers. And then I would show some of those answers on the screen too. I don't always have students read out their answers. So it was a lot of that.
Yeah, okay. What about any behaviors that were there any behaviors that stuck out to you at all from any of your students? Because I know that you usually in that class have some students with
that can be kind of a rowdy class, and I think it's so funny. I think since they saw you in there, they were quieter than usual. So that also threw me off. I'm like, are you guys okay?
Yeah.
But something I've just noticed in the last few weeks is that I have a lot of kids shouting out. And they are answering the question, but I
Right.
think maybe I need to fine tune my method because I'll ask a question that I will take any answer from, but then I get 15 kids shouting at me at once and then I can't hear them. So maybe I like having the random people participate,
Yeah.
but I need to find a way to make it more beneficial so that we can actually hear our answers.
Right. Do you have procedures that you've talked to them about before, like when they're sharing answers, like hand raise or like any kind of, one means that I have an answer, two that it means I have a question or anything like that?
I don't have the last part. I do talk about raising hands, and if I notice the kids are just not minding that, I'll say, I will not listen if
Yeah.
you're not going to raise your hand. And even then, I still have some kids talk over each other.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I just need to have another talk with them, like maybe at the beginning of the lesson, and set my expectations again. Because I'm also noticing just constantly going through those expectations, even after you set them, kids forget.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
They push boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Reteaching your procedures over and over is definitely a big thing. How did they do on their individual assessment that you did after I left?
They were initially confused,
Okay.
and I gave them 4 quotes from the book to analyze, all relating to vision and that motif, the
Okay.
vision, the blindness, and I had them kind of arranged in a map. So there were arrows going around to make it like kind of more visually interesting.
Yeah.
And then at the end, they had to come up with a theme. So they were good with the theme part, but where they had to analyze each quote, I said, I want a 1 to 2 sentence analysis of what this quote means. And even though we've talked about the word analysis, they freeze. They get really
Right.
nervous about that. So we went and did the first one completely together.
Okay.
And it was that quote that you might remember at the beginning where it says, I can see things that mom and dad can't or won't. And so I asked them, what does that mean? He's not literally saying like he can see things like ospreys in the sky that they can't see, right? It's metaphorical. It means something more than just what it is. And then they come up with their answers. They're like, oh, I think it's about Eric, or they're noticing behavior, or they're refusing to notice behavior. So they got it once we did that, and I wrote out the answer on the board, and we all went over it together. And then I did just briefly talk about the second quote with them, just to make sure they were on track and they could keep going. I didn't write an answer for that one so that they were more responsible for taking the words we talked about and putting them on their own.
Yeah. So would you say that when you did that as a class together, the questions, like the additional questions that you asked them about the quote, did those help them write explanations, like
Yes.
write analysis?
I think that helped make it a little more clear.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe, did you change your lesson at all? Like after that, did you include any questions for the other quotes, or did you have them?
I mostly I mostly verbally just asked questions. It was already kind of assigned, so I couldn't make changes on
right
the
then.
document itself. But I did kind of throw out questions for each quote, like focus on this one for this.
Yeah, good. Okay. All right. Well, I think that it was a really great lesson. Again, I saw some really good best practices going over the objective. You were monitoring really well, and the kids seem really engaged. And I think that that's partly because you connected it to, like Disney and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's great.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.